and he was getting on the plane this morning and got delayed. I just didn't want to risk him not being able to talk to us at all by trying to get to us. So he is back home near Pittsburgh, and he will be speaking with us through Zoom today. So Dr. John McNeil Miller is Associate Professor of English at Allegheny College, where he writes and teaches at the intersections of literary criticism, animal studies, and the environmental humanities. His articles and essays have appeared in academic journals such as PMLA, Victorian Studies, and Environmental Humanities. I'll just mention that those are three extremely illustrious journals. To get one article in one of those journals is amazing. He's gotten three. As well as in more public-facing outlets like Literary Hub, The Millions, and Public Books. Dr. Miller's first book, entitled The Ecological Plot, How Stories Give Rise to a Science, was published by the University of Virginia Press in the fall of 2024. And the book argues that the distinct fields of economics, ecology, and realist literature are actually offshoots of the same entangled history of thinking about material relationships, a history reflected in their shared reliance on a particular method of storytelling to reveal how social networks form and operate. So John and I went to grad school together at Rutgers. We were in the English department together for many years. It is my great pleasure to introduce and to welcome Dr. Miller.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cow. Can you all hear me over there? Even in the way back? Wait, raise your hands if you can hear me well on the way back. Can you tinker with it? Can you make it a little louder? I can yell at the screen.
Can you hear it now? Can everybody? Okay.
Does this sound better? We're good? Okay, great. All right, so let me now try to share my screen so you can see my handy dandy PowerPoint here. All right, can you all see that?
Yes, that's
great. Great. All right. So I'd like to start by giving thanks to Professors Vivian Cow and Paul Jawson, to Cherie Sheikh, and to everyone at Lawrence Tech involved in making this talk possible. I wish, obviously, I could actually be there in person with you all today. But either way, it's a real honor to be hosted as part of a lecture series that's devoted to interdisciplinary thinking. Having the chance to talk at an institution that's focused on science, technology, and engineering, but that also recognizes the importance of making time, space, and programming available for exploring the connections between STEM and the humanities is it's pretty rare and really pretty inspirational. Emphasizing those kinds of connections is, I think, key to our survival. And I'm speaking now not just as a literary scholar who's concerned with the long-term prospects of the humanities, but more fundamentally as a human being concerned with ecology, sustainability, and environmental justice. So my talk today is an early and very preliminary attempt to think critically about how connections between scientific fields and linguistic communication have been understood and why. It builds on some work I've already done, which I'll mention in the second half of this lecture. But it also marks a more experimental turn in my own thinking that's driven by the kinds of media I've become curious about as I've encountered them online and in my personal life. So in short, a lecture in the Experimental Curiosity series seems like the perfect place to sort of test the waters on these subjects. And I'd be delighted to get feedback and pointers and criticism from all of you. So I'll begin by stating the obvious. The environmental challenges facing the 21st century are daunting. At times they can be depressing, at other times downright terrifying. But as we've come to recognize just how sizable and complex these challenges are, as we've come to recognize that they're so-called wicked problems that aren't confined to one discipline or one particular community, a positive thing. A sense of collaboration and teamwork has emerged too. Precisely because conservation issues involve so many different communities, so many different sets of values, and so many different disciplinary specialties, we now recognize that no one field or skill set can handle them alone. Environmental issues are interdisciplinary, so they demand an interdisciplinary response. I'm going to talk today about one of the standard ways we approach this cross-disciplinary response when confronted with environmental problems. Because I'm trained as a literary scholar, I'll be focusing on the relationship between the sciences and the humanities, particularly storytelling. What I've noticed is that there seems to be a general but unofficial agreement about how science and storytelling should be related to each other. I don't think there's been any kind of formal meeting to codify this and set it in stone. Nevertheless, there does seem to be a widely accepted model for how science and storytelling work in collaboration and partnership with each other. Today, I'm going to be calling this unofficial, but I think pretty widespread model, the translation model. You all see that advanced slide? We're good?
Yes.
Cool. So here's how, in general, I think the translation model works. In the model, first, scientists use research to discover facts about the world. That's the discovery phase. But science is complicated. It's very quantitative. It requires a lot of specialized training. Regular people can't understand it or maybe relate to it or figure out what its consequences might be. So we have the translation. Humanists, artists, and storytellers all sort of step in, develop some scientific literacy, and then try to make sense of those facts that scientists have given to the wider community and try to communicate them to the public to show why they matter. And if all that works out well, then those two steps are followed by some kind of action, right? Like scientific ideas have now been spread through these middlemen to the broader community. There's shared ideas, shared feelings, shared values, and that enables the wider public to sort of incorporate that science into how we live, into the kinds of policies that we craft, and ideally to avert any kind of major ecological disaster and usher in something like a nice, sustainable, community-friendly future. So by the end of this process, science and culture each have a role to play, and they work together to shape a better world. This particular idea of the relationship between science and storytelling, even though I haven't been able to find anyone really sort of like laying this out in some kind of position paper, it seems to be everywhere. I see it at the beginning of every semester. In fact, when I teach cross-disciplinary English courses, I teach courses on literature and the environment and literature and science. And one of the ways that I open those courses is by asking students about the connections between science and literary study. I don't keep data on this. I could probably sort of like go back and compile data. But pretty much without fail, the vast bulk of responses describe something like the translation model, meaning that by the ages of, at my institution, normally like 18 to 22 students, typically already see literature as a way to help people understand and imagine and feel strongly about the things that scientists are discovering. And you know, no wonder, because you see this kind of thing everywhere. It's all over popular culture, where articles like this one by Sam Nestor in The Revelator, an environmental journalism outlet, argue on behalf of this kind of model. Interestingly, all without quite ever recognizing it as a model, as one that might be flawed or one that might be supplemented by other models of what interdisciplinary collaboration looks like. There's even an emerging field or specialty called science communication or SciComm that's been founded to facilitate the kind of work required by this translation model of cross-disciplinary communication. So there's like social media hashtags for SciComm. There's resource pages at major institutions. There's professional associations for science communication. And there's graduate programs to help people specialize in this kind of interdisciplinary training. But the process of familiarizing people with the translation model actually starts much earlier than this sort of undergrad, graduate, professional level. I even see this model in books that I read to my young children. Here's one that I've read and reread many times over the past few years. Luckily, my children are now sort of moving out of the picture book stage, but this was a staple for us. It's an installment in the beloved Magic School Bus franchise called Glacier Adventure. It's from 2018. The book itself is adapted from the cartoon series, which in turn was adapted from the Magic School Bus books that I grew up with 30 some years ago. So Glacier Adventure is all about climate change. And like many children's books, it's actually worth a closer look. Glacier Adventure stars DA, a brainy young girl in elementary school. DA is working hard to prepare a public presentation about climate change that she's going to deliver very soon. Here's a little excerpt of the opening of the book. Interestingly, climate change is not mentioned on the first page, which might be a sign of sort of the political conflicts around it. DA is practicing a story in front of Ms. Frizzle's class, but her story has too many facts and figures. The class is bored. DA is supposed to tell the story at a festival tomorrow. How can I wow everyone if I'm not a good storyteller? She sighs. So DA's brilliance, unfortunately, comes with its own problems. And despite her name, she's not planning to go into law and become a district attorney. DA is basically an aspiring young scientist. She's got all the information at her fingertips, but she doesn't seem to be able to use it to reach people. Luckily, her teacher is the amazing Miss Frizzle, whose magic school bus takes the kids on all sorts of astonishing field trips that seem to have the power to make her students care about anything and everything. Weirdly, though, I've noticed that Ms. Frizzle never seems to teach her students anything but science. Here, however, Ms. Frizzle suddenly unveils an unsuspected body of knowledge. She also knows about literature. Suddenly, Ms. Frizzle appears. To tell a great story, you need to feel what you're saying. You need a story that's earth-changing. It's a great pun, Ms. Frizzle. Props to you. The next 15 pages involve a rollicking adventure to the Arctic and a lot of time travel to see how different the world was in past geological eras. All that travel gives DA ideas about how to move beyond the mind-numbing facts and figures to experiences that actually matter to people. In the end, spoiler alert if you're planning to read it, DA uses the powers of the bus to produce a multimedia presentation featuring woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and other wonders of the natural world, only to show how this once bountiful nature is now being destroyed by airplanes and other symptoms of industrialization. Makes me feel good about not flying in today, actually. Both the book and DA's presentation end with images of bikes, tree planting, and rainbows, as well as an insistence on the importance of, and here I'm quoting, sharing the story glaciers tell us. We can work together to give this story a happy ending for the glaciers and for us, says DA. DA has crushed it. This is sort of the final page. The crowd cheers. DA wowed them. She told a great story that was full of facts, and it had lots of feeling too. So presumably all the problems associated with climate change are now well on their way to being solved. What a wholesome book. I'm being sarcastic, obviously, but there are many reasons to like this approach to how science and storytelling work together. For one thing, it seems to promise a solution to a problem that's now several centuries old, the problem of the two cultures, as it's sometimes called. So at least since the Romantic era, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there's been a growing sense of a rift between science and art. And to be fair, writers, and I'm going to blame poets in particular, are at least partially responsible for this rift. In his poem, The Tables Turned from 1798, the English romantic, he did spend some time in France. The English romantic William Wordsworth famously attacked attempts to see nature through the lens of physical science. He argued instead that nature was a place of emotional and spiritual fulfillment. In his view, intellectual analysis destroyed that kind of enjoyment, an enjoyment he advanced through his own poetry. In one famous stanza of this poem, he writes, "Sweet is the lore which nature brings. Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect." More than 50 years later, and a full ocean away, the American poet Walt Whitman was still saying much the same thing. Poetry and nature, he wrote, have a kind of natural kinship built on emotion and mystical feeling, a kinship that science can sometimes sicken or destroy with all its facts and charts and numbers. Here's his poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, from his Civil War collection, Drum Taps. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer, where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. This poem is almost perfectly divided in two. In the first section, the first 4 lines, Whitman goes to a lecture to learn about the stars, but it doesn't sit well with him, and he can't quite say why. In fact, he prefers not to say why. He describes his science sickness as unaccountable, unable to be explained. And that's a strategic choice because it's exactly the supposedly dull quantitative precision of the astronomer's attempts to explain everything Whitman finds so awe-inspiring, that makes him sick. He's disgusted in a very bodily way by all the proofs, figures, columns, charts, and diagrams laid out before him, and the various mathematical operations performed on them. If you look carefully, his first 4 lines actually mimic or parody the astronomer's boringly precise way of approaching the nature that matters so much to Whitman. The lines all begin with this dully repetitive when, that mimics a scientific emphasis on precise measurements of time, but also threatens to put the reader to sleep. The lines also grow and they accumulate the way scientific knowledge is supposed to, but in the process, they get too long, spilling over from verse into prose. They lose the magic of poetry. When Whitman leaves the lecture, and that's the last 4 lines of the poem, he also leaves the world of mathematical accuracy that fails to appeal to his embodied emotional and artistic self. He refuses to explicitly account for the sickness for one thing, but he also refuses to divide time in the ways the astronomer does. The poem moves from that precise when, to a more emotional and open-ended, how soon? We never know exactly how soon. We couldn't pinpoint when he's actually walking out of the lecture. And that's kind of the point. We also never know exactly when Whitman looks at the stars because he's thrown out the scientific precision for a more literary and emotional version of time itself. He looks at the stars from time to time. This process of rejecting boring scientific measurements and facts enables Whitman to come fully into his own, to become a being of almost planetary motions and significance himself. He doesn't just get up and leave. That's how I would describe leaving a lecture. He rises like the sun or moon and glides like they do to the sky. His rejection of science and his privileging of a kind of literary humanity restores him to himself and also restores a sense of wholeness and active participation in the larger universe. The literary and the scientific are pitted against each other, in other words, as Whitman tries to carve out a space for art. Art assumes importance as the place where we can find those forms of emotional and spiritual connection that science cannot provide in his account. This idea of a division of labor between the arts and sciences didn't go away. By the 1950s, a scientist turned writer named C.P. Snow had not only brought new attention to the rift between science and literature, but given it a name, the two cultures. Snow was sick and tired of so-called intellectuals lamenting the fact that scientists didn't know Shakespeare, when these same literary intellectuals didn't know equally basic things from the sciences. His example was the second law of thermodynamics. He was disgusted by a kind of cultural power structure where these snobs look down their noses at practical, hardworking scientists. So here's a little quote from this book. There have been plenty of days when I've spent the working hours with scientists and then gone off at night with some literary colleagues. It was through living among these groups that I got occupied with the problem of what I christened to myself as the two cultures. I felt I was moving among two groups who, in intellectual, moral, and psychological climate, had so little in common, one might have crossed an ocean. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Today, the situation, at least to me, feels similar, albeit with the power and prestige sort of reversed. STEM is all the rage, with people rushing for jobs and education in the scientific fields. And sometimes they look askance at anyone who seems harebrained enough to pursue literature as anything more than an interesting hobby. But even if the power dynamic has changed, the rift is still there, and it still feels like a problem. Enter the translation model. its notion of an alliance between science and storytelling suggests one way to solve the problem. That's part of its appeal. In the translation model, science and literature both matter, but they can save the world only with their powers combined, to borrow a phrase from an old environmentalist cartoon of my own youth, Captain Planet. Over the past few years, however, I've come to sort of resent the translation model of the arts and sciences. I dislike it because it doesn't really address the rift. It just finds a nice way to act like we all agree that both sides of the divide are important. If many people and institutions seem excited to embrace the translation model, I don't think that's because it solves the problem of divided and to some degree divisive disciplines. I think people are excited about it precisely because it feels comfortable. It doesn't do anything that's really that new. We accept it because it's easy. We already know it. And it fits with what Western education has already been saying for more than 100 years. It doesn't present any significant difference from how we already educate people and how we already run things. In the translation model, it's still the case that science is the realm of objectivity and the arts are the realm of subjectivity. Science is still pretty much factual and numerical. The arts are still emotional and verbal. Science is still founded on this kind of methodical experimentation, and the arts are founded on something sort of airier, more like imagination. You might want to say unfounded, since they don't have that kind of root necessarily in facts that science is perceived to have. And so as a result, science is still this realm of truth and certainty, and the arts are still this realm of sort of uncertain but mystical and wonderful wondering. So in the translation model, there's sort of a paying of lip service to sort of like that gooey romantic stuff on the literature and artistic side of the divide, but it doesn't really challenge the divide at all. And I think that's a problem because both my experience in research and my experience in teaching suggests to me, at least, that the divide is false. It's simply not an accurate picture for the way these practices, these modes of knowledge relate to each other. What I think is that we need not a sort of respectful separation combined with teamwork and a new subspecialty of these talented science communicators who sort of act as middlemen between these distinct fields. What we need is deeper integration, because in practice, the sciences and the humanities are inseparable. Breaking them apart as fields of study is a misguided decision if we want to understand the reality of how we actually operate, how we live in the world. So let me give you one example of my personal experience with what this does to people's psychologies, this sort of translation model, how it affects their approach to knowledge, to education, and to those wicked problems of the present, especially with regards to the environment. When I teach literature courses designed to draw in science students, there is a broad respect for literature and a sense that it's distinct from science. But this respect for literary study turns out to be pretty flimsy whenever humanistic and scientific sources contradict each other, as I found out a while back when I accidentally stumbled on one such contradiction. About 6 to 7 years ago, a student of mine named Lauren Fugate, a one-time science major who ended up switching to English, approached me about doing summer research together on some topic at the intersection of literature and science. I suggested she work on the cultural history of the European starling. Sturnus vulgaris is its scientific name, the common starling, but we call it the European starling here in the US. It's a mid-sized bird. You can see a picture of it there. It was introduced to the US in the late 1800s. And since that introduction, starlings have developed a reputation as a problematic invasive species, chasing woodpeckers and other birds from their nesting holes and doing almost $1 billion of damage to American agriculture every year. The project was interesting from a literary perspective, though, because of how starlings were introduced to the United States. As the story goes, they were brought over by a sadly misguided man named Eugene Schieffelin in 1890, who was trying to import into the US every single bird mentioned in Shakespeare's work. Kind of a crazy project. It's a fascinating anecdote. It's widely repeated in major news sources. You can see here one from the BBC, but I could have picked pretty much any major news outlet has at least once reported on this. And it's widely reported in scientific books too. As an amateur birder myself, I'd seen and heard this anecdote countless times. But as a literary scholar, I felt some lingering skepticism toward it. I'd never seen a good historical source about this guy, Eugene Schieffelin's motivations. The story, when I found it in books, was rarely accompanied by footnotes. And when it was, those footnotes never actually went back to the 1890s when all of this supposedly happened. So together, Lauren and I decided to look into it. When we began the research, we had a simple, straightforward question. Was William Shakespeare really the inspiration for the introduction of starlings to the United States? We secured some summer research funding from my institution, Allegheny College. I helped Lauren navigate the archive of newspapers and magazines and journals and other sources that might be useful on the starlings, and I sort of just set her loose. Lauren was an amazing collaborator, and only a couple of weeks passed before she had some preliminary results. First, there seemed to be no evidence for Shakespeare being the inspiration behind this 1890 release of Starlings. There was an 1890 release, and Schieffelin was responsible for it, but there was no clear tie in the historical record to Shakespeare at all. So that was sort of surprising. But even more surprising was that we found solid evidence for pre-1890 releases. So Schieffelin did release them, but he didn't seem to be the first one. And then, this was sort of the most stunning one of all, not only was there evidence for pre-1890 releases, but there was evidence for feral or wild starling populations in the US before 1890, meaning that not only had people just sort of like let them go to see what happened, but then people had encountered starlings in the wild. People who were not releasing them was like, oh, that's a starling, including reports from British people who had moved to the US, so knew what starlings were, could identify them very clearly. So they were already here when Schieffelin released them. He didn't know they were here, and then he released them later. So taken all together, that was exciting news. Basically, what it meant was that much of the Schieffelin story, not all of it, but much of it seemed to be fiction. And the story's shakiness had scientific consequences. Scientists have actually used the 1890 date to model how an invasive species like starlings could spread in the US. They treat 1890 as a date for a single point introduction into Manhattan, into New York City, and then use later sightings to map the rate of spread for this invasive species. Our evidence of pre-1890 populations made any such models invalid, or at least in need of some kind of substantial revision. At this point, we basically answered our initial research questions, but we had more time and money for research. We didn't think it would happen as fast. Lauren was very good. So we decided to dig deeper. I suggested that we pivot, focusing now on trying to figure out when the Shakespeare connection was first posited. Like, why did people think Shakespeare was involved if we couldn't find any evidence that he was? And along the way, we'd also try to chart how human perceptions of the starling shifted from the 1800s, when they were introduced without a second thought, even sort of welcomed into the US, to the 2000s, when they were and still are vilified as an invasive species. And that is when we had to directly confront the impact of the translation model on how research and scholarship work. The week after we shifted focus, I met with Lauren to discuss what she'd found. She'd read through a number of poems, stories, newspaper articles, and works of scholarship on starlings, and she had a sense of when attitudes toward the starling shifted from positive and welcoming to negative and hostile. But when she talked about it, she kept framing it in an interesting way. She would say things like, it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that people began to figure out what we know today, that starlings are a destructive invasive species. That way of framing things bothered me, but it took me a while to figure out why. Eventually, I realized that it was an example of what we in the humanities would call presentism, a common temptation of historical research. Presentism is essentially a form of prejudice against the past. It's the automatic assumption that human knowledge right now is correct and enlightened, whereas human knowledge in the past consisted of mistakes or as a series of shaky, unreliable, and flawed steps toward our excellent, all-knowing, and supreme present. When I asked Lauren how we arrived at this enlightened knowledge of the present day, her answer was simple: science. But there was a problem with that too. Our research had already uncovered that science was wrong about two things that scientists either explicitly or implicitly took to be facts. One, when wild starlings first became established in the US, and two, why. So despite having already used humanistic methods to overturn two known scientific facts, we were still falling into the trap of using known scientific facts to shape our attitude toward our research subject. And this is another form of prejudicial thinking we have a name for in the humanities, scientism. Scientism is distinct from science. Scientism is the deep-seated assumption that science is the realm of truth and knowledge, and other disciplines and modes of knowing are correct or incorrect insofar as they do or do not align with current scientific methods and current scientific findings. You can hear the presentism in the scientism too, right? It's all about what science says now and then checking other knowledge against it. Now, look, maybe 21st century scientific claims about the impacts of starlings were extremely strong. I had no idea. But it occurred to me that to see the subject clearly, we basically needed to find out. We needed to expand and deepen our research on the science side of things. We needed to make sure we were respecting science without falling into the trap of scientism. We were not and are not scientists, but we are, I hope, literate, capable, and thoughtful people. We try to be anyway. And I figured, if we could wrestle with the language of Shakespeare and Gertrude Stein, we could probably wrestle with the language of researchers from the US Department of Agriculture too. So together we began to unpack not only the history of cultural attitudes towards starlings in general, but the history of scientific attitudes towards starlings too. We looked for claims about the damage that starlings do, both ecologically and economically. And we tried tracing those claims to their sources in the exact same way we tried tracing the cultural claims about Shakespeare and the starlings to their sources. One of the pitfalls of research is it always takes you longer than you think it will. Like any assignment, like whether you're a student or whether you're a professor, it's sort of like you always think you can get it done. It turns out it takes longer than you think. And it took a couple more years to finish this project. So when Lauren's research funding was up at the end of the summer, I took over, I reread her sources, chased down a bunch of new ones. And what we found in the end was, to me at least, kind of astonishing. The USDA and other researchers have a bevy of numbers about the damage starlings do to agriculture in the US. Their reports showcased all those proofs, figures, charts, and diagrams that Whitman saw as so characteristic of scientific work, even 150 years ago. Those charts and numbers, in turn, are now used to justify poisoning starlings every year on a massive government-sponsored scale. When we looked at what was behind the numbers, though, we found that they were based on two things. The first were statistics about a series of devastating diseases in cattle that could, in theory, be spread by starlings. The problem was that no one had ever found evidence that starlings were even correlated with such diseases, much less actively involved in spreading them around. And that lack of evidence was not the result of a lack of research. There had been repeated experimental attempts to get starlings to spread these diseases to cattle. These experiments failed to substantiate the claim that starlings spread disease, but oddly, each of these failures ended with a conclusion where the researchers claimed it was best to keep poisoning the starlings just in case. And what got picked up and reported from such studies was not the failure to link starlings to disease, but the message that starlings might be spreading it, followed by the numbers of cattle lost to such diseases and the millions of dollars such losses cost the agricultural industry. So that was one glaring omission from the science that wasn't being really acknowledged or reported. But starlings are also blamed for agricultural damage to fruit trees. So we then looked at the second set of widely touted numbers about the damage starlings did to fruit crops in the US. And it's those two numbers, the fruit numbers plus the cattle numbers, that give us that common estimate of almost $1 billion a year losses to US agriculture. As it turned out, the widely quoted and reported numbers were based on projections from a single British study from the 1970s, a study that ultimately blamed cost-cutting farming practices, not starlings, for the agricultural damage associated with starlings. So as far as we could tell, there was no good evidence that starlings were threatening agriculture. In fact, and I won't get into this now, but there was some intriguing evidence that starlings on the whole benefited American agriculture. Okay, but were starlings maybe a dangerous invasive species that was threatening the already declining populations of American birds? Because that would be important too. I looked into it, and again, the evidence said no. we could find only one study that attempted to quantify the impact of starlings on native cavity nesting birds in the US. That study, like the studies about starling spreading disease, had failed to find a significant impact. It suggested that starlings had displaced woodpeckers from their ranges somewhat, but that starlings weren't a factor in any broader population declines. So in the end, we had no evidence for the Shakespeare fanaticism behind the 1890 release, good evidence for pre-1890 releases with starlings already sort of established by 1890 in the US in pockets. There was no solid evidence that starlings do any kind of net damage to American agriculture. And there was no evidence at all that could be found that starlings were doing ecological damage. Now, look, it's still possible that every accusation about starlings might be true. They might be having serious ecological impacts in the US, and they might be having terrible impacts on American agriculture. It's possible. But if so, we don't have good data to prove it, despite looking for it pretty darn hard. And we even have some compelling data that suggests the opposite, at least where agriculture is concerned. So why was there such a big gap between what birders, policymakers, and scientific educators said about starlings and the actual data that scientists could amass on these birds? What's more, why were scientific researchers sticking to their claims about starlings even when they weren't backed up by good data? Why did they keep researching this, trying to design experiments or create models that proved a predetermined conclusion? The answers, we argued, had little to do with truth or facts and everything to do with storytelling. Science and its popularizers had become attached to the idea that every non-native species introduced to the country fit the mold of a particular kind of character, the villainous invasive species that did untold damage to both agriculture and ecology. This tale of invading foreign species is what the environmental humanist Ursula Heise calls a story template, one of those ingrained narratives that we invest with value and use to guide our decision-making, whether we're scientifically trained or not. Researchers and educators believed so deeply and profoundly in that story template, a story they didn't perceive as a story at all, but rather as a difficult, hard-edged truth, that they would pursue evidence of it and create models that confirmed it, even when their own experiments kept telling them their story might be wrong. The result is a massive and ongoing government-sponsored economic program to kill starlings, a program that spreads a toxin called starlicide across North America every year. That program, sometimes nicknamed Bye Bye Blackbird, enriches the companies that make and sell the poison while killing millions of highly intelligent and possibly even beneficial birds every year, to say nothing of the native birds who are killed alongside the non-native species. In late 2021, Lauren and I finally published our findings in the open access journal Environmental Humanities from Duke University Press. And eventually, and I think partly because it was open access and it wasn't just limited to sort of the academic community, it was picked up in the broader press too, which was pretty cool. I don't know, though, how much it's done to change opinions about starlings, because if I learned anything from this whole experience, it's that stories are powerful. They're so powerful that they can repel new information and maintain the fact status of outdated or inaccurate information. They're so powerful that scientists and policymakers are as vulnerable to the allure of storytelling as anyone else. But I also don't like how I just put that. I think seeing stories as distinct from and enemies to information, seeing them as a kind of pathology, a disease even our best thinkers are sadly vulnerable to, is part of the problem. What Lauren and I try to argue at the end of our article is that starlings are a case study in the way scientific facts and cultural values are intermixed. Now, there are two potential responses to that problem. The first is to fight it. We can say, oh, science was tainted here. It turns out that our research was too guided by stories. We need to seek and destroy the stories, get rid of them, make sure that we're back to the good old science of just facts and data and objectivity. And then once that's restored, things will be set right and science will be doing its work again. And if we can just remove the stories, we'll be fine. It's actually very parallel to the just remove the invasive species way of thinking. But fighting it in this way maintains the old distinctions between the arts and sciences that are part of the translation model. And we ourselves had to move beyond that model to even do this research in the first place. So I think there's another alternative response to this intermixture, and that response is, embrace it. Admit that intermixture is natural and necessary. It's okay that culture and science are intermixed. And if we are trained in cultural analysis, then we can try to identify and analyze the stories in the way that Lauren and I tried to do. And then once we know that, we can think about how they shape scientific work and figure out whether those are the best stories to be telling or not. And the scientific data is important to figuring that out and making that kind of decision. So what I'm proposing here is that we need interdisciplinarity now more than ever, but we need to approach it a little more thoughtfully. A translation model of interdisciplinarity is not sustainable if we want the best answers to our questions and the best allocation of our limited resources. We need not a translation model of the arts and sciences, but a synthesis model, one that accepts these stories as internal to, rather than some kind of weird, unfortunate tainting of scientific practice. We need to actually start, cracking open the science, looking for the stories, studying how they operate, and then figuring out strategically how to tell the best stories, especially in those cases, which are everywhere, where we're dealing with limited data, and we have to nevertheless make tough choices about how to allocate money and time and energy and emotion to different kinds of conservation priorities. It's only when we see and respect stories not as these kinds of outside supplements of science and conservation, mere elements of communication and dissemination, but when we see them as integral to it, that we can assess how these stories work and which ones work the best. Lauren has long since moved on from our research. Like I said, this started a long time ago and took a while. She's now a teacher in New Mexico, but I'm still out here plugging away at this, trying to figure out how science and literature can be understood together. My own research, as Dr. Cow briefly mentioned in the intro, has led me to conclude that ecology itself, both as a modern Western science and as a way of understanding communal ethics, emerges from storytelling. That's the claim I try to make anyway in my recent book, The Ecological Plot: How Stories Gave Rise to a Science. There, I return to the roots of both ecological science and the realist novel to show just how much traffic there was before the modern formation of the academic disciplines between these two emerging fields. And I try to show how both of them were heavily influenced by political economy, an early form of economics that worked by trying to trace the circulation of goods within and between nations to gain better control over pricing and a better sense of how policies affected the well-being of individual countries. The political economist Thomas Robert Malthus was particularly influential in this regard. He wrote up an essay on the principle of population in 1798 that told these little anecdotal stories about the circulation of goods and their relationship to communal prosperity. Those storytelling strategies were then picked up by both literary writers and by naturalists, basically the precursors to our modern biologists and ecologists and life scientists, most notably by the author Harriet Martineau and by the naturalist Charles Darwin, whose works then proved foundational to the English realist novel and to ecological science, respectively. What happened over the course of the intervening centuries, though, is that these once relatively verbal and accessible works that helped found modern economics and ecology gave way to increasingly quantitative, technical, and numerical studies of these once narrative or even literary subjects. And don't get me wrong, a lot of good came with that shift. I'm not saying we should throw out our modern disciplines entirely. But it did also mean that the stories underlying the analysis that gave it its sort of scaffolding and the original ideas underneath it all, those stories became downplayed and forgotten, as did their complex interdisciplinary history. Two of the three fields, ecology and economics, increasingly became understood as purely rooted in facts and unrelated to literary storytelling at all. Ecologists and economists stopped recognizing that their subjects were built on certain stories about how the world works, and they stopped thinking of themselves as storytellers. Those developments helped usher in our present moment, when scientists are told that they don't work with stories and need the help of storytellers to communicate their confusing non-literary ideas to the general public. SciComm is then born as this new cross-disciplinary specialty to help fill that role. Now, I have no problem with science communication. I think it's actually a vital field. But I do have a problem with the way that we often teach budding scientists that they aren't storytellers. And the way we teach them that there's a fundamental distinction between what they do and what writers and literary scholars do. It would be more accurate, I think, to say that scientific training involves teaching people only to tell certain kinds of stories and to always write them up and present them in a very limited style or genre, a style designed to display its scientific credentials by adhering tightly to a few formal requirements. The scientific research paper is a distinct genre, that is, a category or grouping of literary texts that's recognizable by certain similarities in style and content. You can tell when you pick up a science paper that it's a science paper. You can just tell by how it's written up, by the form, and also by the kinds of things it's talking about, by the content. So those similarities are the features we call genre conventions in literary study. And here, I would say, are a few of the conventions you can expect the next time you sit down with a scientific research paper. First, they tend to be narrated using one of those story templates that Ursula Heise was talking about. And that story template here is the scientific method, right? You've got sort of like the hypothesis, then you've got the methods that lay out the exact experimental or field setup, and then the results, and then those interpretive conclusions from the data. And virtually every scientific paper I've seen tends to follow something like that story template. There's a narrative of what the scientific research team did. By and large, the most important observations in science papers are those that can be represented numerically. And if there's stuff that can't easily be represented numerically, the scientists involved figure out a way to translate it into numbers. So I was just teaching a paper the other day about how cats respond to pet-directed speech, which is that like high-pitched baby voice we use when we talk to our animals. And in order to gauge this response, the scientific team behind the paper began sort of like breaking down cat behaviors, being like tail flicking, ear movement, grooming, and then sort of quantifying the number that they observed after this kind of pet-directed speech, after this baby talk was spoken. And then they basically got numbers out of cat behavior. So that's a hallmark of scientific papers, analyzing things numerically and quantitatively. Scientific papers tend to minimize personal pronouns like I, we, and you, and they also tend to minimize active voice. Instead of saying, I prepared a solution one night in the lab, they say a solution was prepared, so that the I is gone and that the solution seems to almost prepare itself rather than some flawed, bumbling human coming in and preparing it, right? By and large, most scientific papers tend to avoid personification, or to use the fancier term, anthropomorphism. Basically, try not to treat like lab rats as if they were people, right? And instead of this kind of anthropomorphism or personification, they tend to favor objectification or mechanomorphism, treating lab animals as if they're machines, treating the human brain as if it works like a machine that can be broken into parts and sort of analyzed how each part works and communicates to other parts. Now, these are all writing strategies, and scientists are being rigorously trained in this form of literary composition. They're experts in it. But it's only one narrow kind of literary composition. And what's more, by and large, I think most scientists are not being trained to recognize this stuff as a set of literary or textual practices at all. And that leads me to my current experimental research questions that occupy a lot of my thinking today. So I'll end with those questions and with some of my provisional answers or hypotheses about them. If we acknowledged the literariness of scientific work, what shortcomings of our current practices might be revealed, both scientific practices and literary practices? What new skills could we develop across the disciplines? And what new directions could scientific and literary study take? So I'll address the matter of shortcomings first, and on the more positive note, right? I think our tendency not to think of science as entangled with literature has consequences for how research is shared with the public. When scientists want to share their findings with non-specialists, they may struggle to even see what needs to be changed about the research to make it interesting and accessible to wider audiences. They can't name or locate what they did in their writing to make their ideas into recognizable scientific research. As a result, they may also have difficulty reconfiguring that research into something that a non-specialist public would recognize as an op-ed or an essay or an accessible book. Now, science communicators, journalists, and ghostwriters can help, But that adds an extra step in the process, creating a kind of bottleneck that slows down or limits the dissemination of scientific findings among the general public. So that's a communication issue with social and political consequences. But I also think this insistence on the non-literary nature of science has consequences for the research itself. If scientists are unable to see their research as shaped by literary conventions, they can't see how tweaking those conventions might change their understanding of what they're doing, what they can reasonably conclude from it, and what they should prioritize doing in the first place. And I'd argue that these ingrained literary habits don't just shape how ideas are communicated, they shape what ideas are representable on the page. And so, given the drive to publish or perish, they shape what scientists understand to be scientifically thinkable. Now, there are reasons behind all these scientific genre conventions, of course. I'm not suggesting we discard them wholesale. All I'm pointing out is that they are genre conventions. So there's a history to them, and at least some arbitrariness and contingency to them too. In other words, they don't have to be exactly as they are. They can be experimented with, changed. Some of them might be switched or thrown out entirely. And doing so could open up new ideas and new consequences. Those ideas and consequences might not be visible to someone adhering strictly to established standards of scientific representation and communication. The Starling case study is a good example of how difficult it is in our current moment to recognize how a scientific consensus may be produced not just by data, but also by stories with their own genre conventions. It's also a good example of how taking science seriously as a mode of storytelling makes it possible to reinterpret what's known, what counts as fact, and what count as reasonable conclusions from such facts. So much for the shortcomings of the current system. I'll end with my hypotheses about the benefits of moving in the direction of the kind of synthesis model that I proposed today. When we stop treating science and storytelling as separate activities, when we learn to see the stories embedded in science, we don't diminish the factuality or authority of science. Science doesn't become mere fiction. Instead, we empower scientists to understand the ways they're already communicators and the ways that learning about language can make them not just more effective communicators, but also more effective thinkers and community members. We may even open up new possibilities for how to do science and how to responsibly incorporate scientific findings into our everyday lived experiences of the world. And so we move closer to a more unified understanding of what knowledge is, one that hopefully enables each of us to synthesize skills and ideas from across the disciplines to better tackle the seemingly intractable problems of our present moment. Thank you.
So we'll have Q&A. I'm wondering if it would be better if you have a question, if you go down, just so that John can see you and hear you better through the camera.
Hello, John, and thank you. And my name is Corinne, and I have actually. Yeah. Oh, I'll leave it for me, and I'll tell the camera.
Right there.
Oh, green light.
That's okay.
Oh, okay. Wow, I guess that theater training did nothing. John, my name's Corinne Stavish, and I actually, I don't think I have a question, but I do have some responses. And because I have long been interested in that. And I think one of the differences is that scientists look for facts and storytellers look for truths. And they are not the same thing. And I think you've got gold in this, but as I was listening, I was thinking the title of your story should be Starlings and Underlings. Start with Shakespeare and the quote, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings." And I think that what's missing is the idea of the metaphor for the story is as underlings, we don't understand the stars. And the problem in this story is when the humans don't interpret the signs. I would train scientists first with myth, and secondly with CoAS stories, that the ancients looked at the universe and made through imagination reasonable answers. So, but
Yeah. That sounds great. I agree. I think that notion that we can sort of like get to truths with just facts, right? That the facts are the truths, is part of the problem here, right? Like the facts are the truths, and then the story sort of communicates the facts. And the point is the facts need, I mean, almost every scientific paper has an interpretation section, right? And like that's the humanistic knowledge that's being brought to bear on the data. But I think we could do a better job of emphasizing that the interpretation is basically always going to be humanistic, and it's going to be the attempt to get from those facts to the truths that should be concluded from them.
Truth in context.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the metaphor is. And
Yeah.
we're seeing the reality of that in our current political situation, that the facts become different truths through the way that you refract the light. So, and that's
right.
what it does. The storyteller turns the kaleidoscope, all the same facts, all the same pieces, holds it up to a different light and sees a different pattern. And that's the difference, as I see it, between the scientist and the storyteller and the merging of the two. So
I think that's right.
And just really quick, please make sure your student sign your sign-in sheet before you leave. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. So my field is philosophy, and I work in the cognitive sciences. So a lot of what you said rung true for my experience. So something similar to what you said was something I heard from one of my mentors in grad school, that the discussion section of every scientific paper is a work of philosophy, because they're doing theoretical work that's going beyond what the results themselves provide. But then, there was something that I thought about as you were describing your research process, which again has parallels to what I do. So I read a lot of psychology and then try to contribute something to that literature, which is, it's often hard as someone who is not within that scientific discipline to know when your research is done, because it's very easy to form a tentative conclusion that the people in that discipline have missed something or have misconstrued something. But then for me, the essential next step is to talk to the people in that discipline, because it's hard to know when you yourself are the person who's missing something and they actually know something that you don't know. So I'm wondering what your experience is about entering into dialogue with scientists.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, geez, the trouble of this interdisciplinary work is like, I can tell you right now that a lot of a lot of the quantitative work that goes into a scientific paper is above my head. It's not in my training, and I don't know how to run statistical regressions. I couldn't calculate a p-value if I tried. Like I just can't do that. And so there are certain parts of it where I don't feel comfortable sort of challenging those elements of a scientific work, right? Like I have to respect that expertise. And I think anytime you're doing interdisciplinary work, like you're taking a big risk that you're going to be wrong, and you never know when you've had enough conversation with people in the field to feel like you have a good enough conclusion. The way I'll talk about this in the Starling example, because in the example of like the work in my book, there wasn't sort of like any sort of like scientific consensus that was being challenged. There was sort of like trying to unearth this different history. But in the case of the Starlings, yeah, when we felt like it was ready for publication, I thought, there's a chance that we're going to publish this thing, and or we're going to try to publish it, and like a peer reviewer is going to shoot it down and be like, you don't get the science at all, or that it'll come out and like invasion biologists will be like, oh, you're so wrong, I can't believe you missed this, right? At a certain point for me, it was like, that's a risk I've got to be willing to take, right? Like, you've got to risk being wrong. Like that's what's in any claim. But there is a special kind of insecurity that comes with risking being wrong in a field that you're not trained in, right? But the thing that made me feel relatively confident, even though I'm waiting for some invasion biologists to shoot us down. I sort of expected more pushback when we published it than we got. But the thing that made me feel comfortable was I had read enough in um, invasion biology in both its history and its present form to recognize that there's not as much consensus as there might appear to be among the public, right? So like if you go to a nature center, they'll tell you all about invasive species and how bad they are, and there'll be all sorts of people whose jobs are to manage them and so on and so forth. But every invasive species is different, and some are manageable, some are not. Some probably don't deserve the term invasive at all. And we found enough sources, including, amazingly, there was a textbook of invasion biology put out, I think in like 2010 or the early 20 teens by Oxford University Press, where the conclusion of the textbook was that invasion biology shouldn't exist as a field because the data was too shaky. Which is sort of astonishing, right? Like, so like there are examples of species that cause huge problems, but like to treat it as if it's a field makes it sound as if there's a core truth to it, right? Rather than facts of certain individual species. So in this case, we didn't actually go out and talk person to person with any sort of scientists in the fields that we were challenging. But we tried really, really hard to read around and get a sense of whether we were saying something really off base and we were missing something. And instead, what we found was actually internal to this field, there's a lot of debate. And so it felt like what we found about the starlings and our argument about them might help to continue to advance that debate and to come to some kind of conclusion in it, rather than us just sort of like, bomb throwing into other fields and claiming that we're right and they're wrong, even though we're over our heads. So I think if we hadn't found that, if it had seemed like the field was internally really sound, we would have been a lot more tentative about saying this stuff. And then when it was picked up in the press, the reporter who wrote the first big story on it was like, who should we talk to who's going to disagree with you? And so I gave him the name. I was like, you need to talk to Dan Simberloff. He's gonna destroy this thing if he can. So the reporter did talk to him, and I was like, oh man, this could be ugly. And what Simberloff said was, okay, well maybe starlings aren't the best example. Like didn't push back on us that hard. So I was like, phew. But any day now, it could turn out that we misread something, or that new data comes in and it turns out starlings are a big problem, right? Like knowledge advances, science changes. But I think we have to. You can never know when you've really fully surveyed some field that you're not the specialist in, right? But you've got to hit a point where you feel like what you have to say is helpful enough to the field, rather than just sort of some attempt to like lord some new insight over them, that you're willing to risk, I think, being shut down. And you have to be humble enough to be like, well, if I'm shut down, then at least that'll clarify this issue and clarify the mistake I made, right? Like being corrected is good. It hurts when it's in public, but it's good ultimately.
All right, I'm up next. Hi, John. Myself, I'm back. How are you? My name is Julie Swisler-Volk. I'm a biologist here at Lawrence Tech, so I was very excited to hear about starlings. And your talk reminded me a little bit of the fact that we always talk in biology about sort of public relations. My classic example is dandelions. Apparently people used to love them and think they were pretty and plant them all the time, and now we spend tons of money trying to get rid of them. But so you may be on something. My question was a little bit more about the model or the way of thinking about scientific communication, because I was thinking about, three possible ways to then potentially move forward. And I was kind of wondering where you're at with what you're suggesting. So one model is that, scientists completely change the way we communicate, right? So that it better fits kind of this non-sciencey way of communicating. One is that we essentially code switch. So we talk science to each other, and then we have the ability to, broaden, and all scientists then would need training in both modes of communication. Or I think maybe a third would be what you're, maybe to have scientists who still specialize and communicate with science, but then they partner with individuals who are kind of better potentially. They can understand the science speak, maybe they don't do it themselves, but are better at communicating with the public. And I think that's kind of this translational model where we're at now. I was just wondering, am I correct in summarizing those are kind of three possibilities and what you're leaning towards if you're suggesting that we start to think about how to modulate science communication?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think you're right that third example you gave of sort of like specialize and partner is the translation model that sort of irks me. Not that I think it's totally off the table and must be destroyed, but that I think can reinforce divisions that shouldn't be reinforced. And I don't think that scientists should change necessarily how you all communicate amongst yourselves. The code switching answer is probably the closest to what I'm thinking of, but there's still even in the name code switch, like you can hear the switch, right? Like there's a sense that like there's two distinct things that are moving back and forth. I guess what like in my dream world, and I don't think this is ever going to happen, but hey, you never know. In my dream world, basically like scientists would talk the way that they talk now amongst themselves insofar as that's useful, but they would also recognize it as a way of talking and be interested in playing with other ways of thinking about the stories and the language that go into what they do, right? So I'll give you sort of an example from the literature and science course that I'm teaching right now. So basically that whole course is structured around literary form. But what I'm trying to argue in it is that the literary form isn't just literary, it's also scientific. So each literary concept that I'm bringing to the table, I know them because I'm a literature specialist, right? But what I'm trying to sell the students on is they know them too because they're used in science, but they wouldn't call them that thing and they wouldn't think of all the different ways they might be able to use them. So for instance, like we're just wrapping up a unit now on plot. And I'm trying to make the argument that plot is basically the exploration of causality and correlation that scientists are sort of investigating, right? Often. And so basically every time that a scientist says like, oh, this neurotransmitter is linked to this thing, like that's a plot. That's storytelling. And that doesn't diminish it, but you could think of it as a plot. Then we'll move to sort of metaphor. And we'll talk about how metaphors and models could be conceived of as basically the same thing, right? Like functionally, when you're working on a rat model in a psych lab, you're using the rat as a metaphor for a human. And this sort of, I think, I have to think more about this further, but I think this sort of scales all up and down to scientific models. A metaphor is just when two things are equated that are not obviously and regularly linked in space and time. That's what a metaphor is. And so every time that we even like, for instance, in that cat article I just taught, every time that there's numbers that are used to represent cat behavior, and then those are graphed on a page as bar graphs, right? Like there's a red chunk of color, and you say like, this is the cat's behavior. Well, there's no natural linkage between a cat's behavior and a red bar on a page. But when you make that linkage and say this is that, you're basically doing metaphorical work. So I guess what I kind of want is almost like a shared set of analytic terms that will enable scientists to think of what they do as having a substantial literary component, and then to play with those components more freely in order to see the literary elements, which I think in the Starling case, for example, like would have been very helpful because the story of Eugene Schifflin introducing starlings to the US and not realizing the damage of what he was going to do is basically modeled on a story template from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? Like this idea of like the guy who's scientifically interested in nature, and then pursues some course of action that he thought it would be sort of scientifically beneficial to do this, but it ends up wreaking havoc on the world. Like that's Frankenstein. And to recognize when you tell that story, if you're a scientist or scientific educator, that you're telling the Frankenstein story is not even to say that it's factually wrong. It turns out in that case it was factually wrong, but is to recognize that you are borrowing from a story template and that story template assigns certain roles to the starling and to Schifflin and to science and to the humanities and all sorts of things that might be conceived of differently and if you see it as a story, you can imagine conceiving of it differently and telling it differently, and then maybe looking at the data differently. So it's not so much sort of like, well, we've got these two languages. Do we specialize in partner? Do we suddenly start talking like lay people? Or do we code switch? It's sort of like, I think that we're all using sort of permutations of the same language, and we should think of it as language so that we can more self-consciously explore the impacts of the permutations that we choose to use.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Julia, and I'm a SciComm person. So, hello, I'm really sad you're not here because I'd corner you and keep you for a long time. But my undergrad's in biology, and I have to say, like, in terms of what you're talking about, the only biology course I really remember, sorry, Julie, was my history of science course, where we had to read like on origin of the species. We had to come up with like biographies of Mendel and Curie and present them to the class. And what I've come to realize later through social sciences and SciComm is it's because evolutionarily humans have told stories for so long that we don't trust data. We actually trust stories, right? Because we've been hardwired to do that. So my kind of question is, because I totally agree with your intermix, and I feel like, as you said at the beginning, your students are really open to the combination of science and literature, or science and humanities, because they haven't been siloed yet. Do you know what I mean? Like, they haven't been with the same people for so long that they're more open to these different types of approaches. And my worry kind of is, if we don't integrate these things in undergrad, because we do see them a little bit more in grad programs, but not very much, but if we don't integrate them, what do you think is going to be like the biggest danger in the future? Just because everybody is tight, you know, tight curriculums. People don't always value this, but clearly there is a value to it. So what happens if we don't take what you're saying to heart?
Yeah, the world ends. Yeah, I mean, if we don't take it to heart, we're just where we are right now, right? Like we haven't taken it to heart. So where we are right now is, you know, we're very effective and good at doing certain things, and we're not so good at doing other things, and we can sort of like, you know, create the SciComm specialty and so on to help bridge these gaps that we've sort of taught ourselves to see as gaps. I don't know. Like, I get basically it's sort of like we're already on the siloing road, and you know, I wouldn't even say that my students. Maybe I presented my students in too favorable a light. They you know, like I said at the beginning, they are willing to respect literature and to respect science, but when there's any kind of conflict, it's like science is going to win. You know, it's like they're respectable until they start to fight, and then there's a side. And I see many of them say like, I'm not a literature person, I'm a scientist. Or some who do the opposite, right? They're like, I'm a literature person, like science is not for me. And I'm trying to get them to see like, well, there's literary elements in science and there's science elements in literature, and so we shouldn't be. I think they're already siloed. Like we shouldn't be siloing them in this way. I think if we, you know, you mentioned this history and sort of like philosophy of science course. I think every scientist has a right to be trained in the history and philosophy of science, right? Like I think it's really helpful. And I think literature feeds into that. And so I don't think we can get any like worse in the siloing than where we are now. Maybe we could, if we move it back younger and younger, right? Like that's how it can get worse. But it's already happening. And it's already happening, I think, at a relatively young age, where most of even the first years I see do show evidence of the siloing, but have sort of like this fragile like detente or truce or something between these two sides. But I think if we worked harder to basically ensure that all students, it feels weird to me because I keep sort of being like, here's what we should do for science programs. It's like, well, I'm not in a science program. What should we do for literature programs? I think that the kind of course that I try to teach, these literature and science courses, these literature and environment courses, are basically attempts to get anyone, whether they're a scientist who doesn't think of themselves as a literary person or a literary person who doesn't think of themselves as a science person, to recognize that like those aren't like opposed affiliations, and that it doesn't serve them to sort of reject different forms of knowledge or different sort of manifestations of knowledge, or to identify with one or the other, to get the literature people to realize like they can understand science and scientific papers, right? They might not know every number and what it means, but they can get the gist, and they can actually use even literary strategies to help get the gist, and to help scientists realize that they do know literary strategies. They're just only using certain forms of them. I think that helps to erode some of that siloing that you're talking about. And so I think that yeah, we're hardwired to attach to stories, but I don't think that scientists are not telling stories, right? Like I think that they're hardwired for those stories too. We failed to explain that they are telling stories with their data. And I think that can only benefit everyone to sort of think through the ways that you don't have to pick a side or an affiliation. And I think that means that literature courses need to be addressing even scientific papers, and need to be addressing history and philosophy of science in literature, and even maybe some scientific practice. And I think that science should involve the teaching of these things as well. And I mean, I think it's hard to predict, like, well, what would happen if we did that? I don't know, but hopefully this sort of clarification of the kind of thing that the Starling case study shows, right? This sort of ability to think a lot harder about where stories are cropping up, and a lot harder about how to make people care about the stories, and how to think through them differently. Yeah.
Do you have one more question?
I'll stop being polite.
Go for it.
Hi, John. Jason Barrett. I'm a history professor. Thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I particularly liked about it is the example of the starling invasive species really shows how the storytelling you're talking about is rooted in that romantic conception of nature. And the dichotomy you're setting up between science and storytelling makes a lot of sense for your purposes. But I tend to think that the storytelling is there whether we consciously choose to translate or not. And that what we're doing instead is there's a narrative form about the naturalism of nature that's very consistent with academic environmental humanities. But there are other story forms that are more alien to us. I teach history of technology, and I talk about the storytelling of mastery. That is, that science's job is to extend human mastery over the world, and it's a kind of inflation of human agency. But that's a storytelling that's very common about the nature of science, but it locks us into a set of priorities like, screw it, kill the starlings, right? If it's a story about human mastery and the extension of human agency, then it's much more important that DDT gets produced effectively, cost effectively, and gets bred, and some starlings have to die along the way. But that, of course, is a storytelling, the foundational values of which can strongly offend some of us who are invested in environmental justice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What I hear in your presentation is a kind of false dichotomy between either science or this romantic version of natural storytelling. And what I see more in practice in my own studies is science abetted either by a storytelling that enables one set of social priorities, or science enabled by a different type of story form that enables a different competing set of priorities. Does that make sense, the question I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And the Starling case is so interesting in terms of this, right? Because when, like, if you all ever encounter the Schifflin story in the wild about Shakespeare and the starlings, you know, the reason I compare that story to Frankenstein and think of it as basically like modeled on the Frankenstein template is because Frankenstein exists in the borderlands between the two kind of stories you're talking about, right? Like, okay, Frankenstein's a romantic novel, and there's all sorts of passages in there about how beautiful nature is and how consoling it is. And Victor Frankenstein basically becomes interested in science as a form of power over nature, right? He's obsessed with alchemy first because he wants to be the guy who transmutes lead into gold. Then he converts to modern science after he sees like lightning strike a tree and he's like, that's so powerful. I want power. And then of course he gets the power in one sense because he gets the power to create life. But what happens is he discovers that like he can't actually control what he thought he could master, right? And what the Shiflin story is generally used to, it's generally treated as a cautionary tale, much like Frankenstein, where it's sort of actually trying to undermine the narrative of scientific mastery. And yet it's told, it's not like it's told by anti-science people, it's told by environmental educators and birders. And so it seems to me like, yeah, like science, there's sort of like that romantic, like nature, like humans need to be humble. Nature is beautiful, we should protect it story that is almost sort of like the more environmental activist side of the sciences. There's that sort of like technological mastery story, which is internal to the sciences. But then science has also internalized stories about the dangers of the mastery story, right? And that's what the Starling story is used to talk about. So like, oh, Shiflin thought he knew what he was doing. He thought he could like improve nature in the US by releasing the starlings, but instead they've destroyed everything. So let that be a lesson to you. You should be really careful about trying to exert mastery over nature. So I agree, there's these sort of two different stories, but then there's also like this hybrid where science has internalized this Frankenstein narrative where it's like you can't control too much, and invasive species are an example of what you can't control. And while I have this sort of like bleeding heart, like don't poison the starlings feeling, they're wonderful birds, they're beautiful and smart. The biggest problem with poisoning the starlings is it doesn't really do anything. They keep coming back. Right? They're not declining. Like the native birds are declining, they're dying alongside them, but the starlings are here to stay. And this is the case with a lot of invasive species. It's different if you have sort of like ecological islands, and if you have specialist species that aren't generalists, but like starlings, they're in the continental US, they're spread everywhere, they're generalists. Like it would be really impressive if a certain amount of poisoning could possibly destroy them. Like you can't win against them. So while I feel the biggest ethical problem is native birds are dying and starlings are dying, and there's no need. You could also say it's just a waste of money, even according to the technological mastery narrative, where it's like we want to make sure that we shape nature to be as productive economically and agriculturally as possible. There's still no reason to poison the starlings. You're not going to win. You're just going to throw money away, at least as far as I can tell from what we know now, and from other examples of invasive species. That there's always campaigns against them, but if they're generalists and they're not on some kind of isolated island or river system or something like that, it's very hard to really contain them in any significant way. So it's an interesting story that sort of throws a wrench into the mastery one, even if you follow that. It's sort of like the conclusions of the starling study that we did, if you buy it, are like whether it's because you care about the starlings or because you care about money, like just this, why are we doing this? It's pointless.
Well, yeah, I do. I have a follow-up, and I also have this internal storyteller that says, when you end something, go back to the beginning. So since I was the first one, when you said the rats are humans, it seems to me as you're describing the starlings that they are a metaphor for humanity. The generalists who keep persisting. And I just wanted to recommend a book, you may be familiar with it, but it's The Science of Storytelling, why storytelling, and it's called The Storytelling Animal by Jonathan Gottschall. And he lays out the scientific reasons that we are hardwired for story. So
awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I've heard of the book, but I haven't picked it up yet, so I will.
Yeah.
And I think you're right about starlings. I think there's always like a lot of the pest species that in starlings are classified as both invasive and pests, right? Whether it's the pests of rats or cockroaches or whatever. I think a lot of the animosity towards these sort of vermin is the fact that they're commensals. These are basically creatures that are figured out. They like how humans live. Right, like at least in some parts of the world, depending on sort of like what species you're looking at, right? But so any attempt to eradicate them is always sort of, it's about eradicating a competitor for whatever resources we have, but it's also about this attempt to maybe sort of like exercise a kind of exercise out of ourselves a kind of self-hatred that we can't admit is there.
Don't psychologists say that we dislike in others what we most dislike in ourselves?
Yes, exactly.
Story.
Let's thank Dr. Miller again.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, John. Hang on just a second. I'll say bye. Again, please sign up for your student and take the pizza. And students in my class, you're still here, remember to read your responses are due on the lecture by 11:59 tonight. Thank you guys. Thank you all for coming.
Great job. Yeah, I'm gonna give. Okay, John, I'm just gonna disconnect you here from the camera.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. Hey. Oh, he's gone. Yeah. Here you go. They had to take their adapters. So.
Oh, okay.
There you go. He can probably see you in the recording. Or you can stop the recording right here. And then let's see. Stop.